Thank you, everybody. Let me just get my notes here. Yeah, so I think interestingly enough, I had a very hard time thinking about what to title this this lecture, whatever. My first thought was capturing Black performance. But I think that actually in thinking about this whole notion of like how I should name this thing, I think that kind of lends itself ultimately to what Black performance is. It's an active evasion of definition, of capture, of all these things, right? So I think like one of the central questions that one asks themselves when trying to like create an expression of this is like, how do I express something that intrinsically evades definition, right? And as like a Black artist, how do you do that and then yourself try to evade definition? I think that that's ultimately one of the things that's at the center of like my father's work is he never wanted to be defined by a single sort of notion of like Black artists, for example. But what he wanted to do was express the music that he loved and the spirit of that music. So with that, I have a ton of pictures, like so many. I hope that we get through them all. So of course, this is the Count Basie portrait that you saw in the other room. So I won't I won't stay on this too long. But I think one of the central kind of challenges in trying to create a portrait like this is like, what image do you choose to like ultimately create a rendition of Count Basie, right? Well, I think the answer is like, you don't choose a single image. You choose a multitude of moments. What's up? Oh, we do need the mic?
I think we're going to use one.
Okay. Okay.
A little bit of side noise in here.
Okay. We'll hold for 1 second. Hello? Okay. Okay. So I think that, you choose a series of moments, right? And I think for whatever reason, and I don't even think that there's a way to even fully describe the reason, like these moments in jazz music have been sort of like a central subject for photographers. And I think it's ultimately because of how powerful these individuals are, etc., via their music. Their music creates this power, and it ultimately comes from this like particular aura of these individuals. And that's what you try to put onto canvas, right, is these individuals' aura. So all this to say is, I think you choose moments, right? So here's just a series of photographs of Count Basie that I think sort of, come together. It's his swagger, right? It's his intentionality, right? His ability to direct an orchestra. It's also this incredible ability to play, right? I mean, if you see this image like this, right, you see the speed at which his like hands move. I think there's something that's almost like, extraordinary about that, right? And that's what kind of creates the power of this music, right? It's all of these things that bring together an individual. So here's another image that actually is not necessarily Count Basie, but I think it kind of represents this notion of like duality that all comes together in a single moment of playing, right? So I think also when we're thinking of like portraits of individuals that are like band leaders, I think another one of my father's favorite subjects was Duke Ellington. So I think with Ellington, we see this like grace, this immense grace, right? We see this concern, this deep feeling that he has that kind of, that permeates a song like in a sentimental mood, right? And also you see like the power with which he's directing an orchestra, right? And we just see this like moment of playing, right? We see how deep this individual goes into a space. And ultimately then this is how maybe we try to reconcile with all of those moments in creating an image. So here's the other image that's in the other room. They have the right to sing the blues, right? And I think that this image is also a notion that Black women have been central within the history of, it goes beyond Black music, it goes to music as a whole, right? So I wanted to think for a moment about Betsy Smith, and there's this wonderful kind of quote from Angela Davis in her book, Blues, Legacies, and Black Feminism, where she talks about Betsy Smith for a moment. So if you'll allow me, I'm going to read from it. Sorry, I did all of this on my phone. Okay. So Davis writes, Betsy Smith recorded numerous songs invoking problems emanating exploitation, alienation, and for women, male dominance in the North, which had been the focus of black people's hopes and dreams since the earliest days of slavery. Her songs, more than those of any other blues performer of the era, constructed aesthetic bridges linking places and time and permitting a collective price de conscience, encompassing both the unity and heterogeneity of the black experience, right? All of this, like, and even if you're dealing with the challenge of how do you even write about this music, right? You know, all of this kind of comes up into these moments where you see a moment like this, where we kind of see this maybe like sort of like soulful, beautiful singing from Smith, right? To a moment maybe like this, where we see this like deep moaning and longing that she has when she's singing about love and the many things that love could mean. There's a recent piece by Arthur Jaffa called A Hydra, where he's sort of challenging some of these ideas of like, well, what is R&B music? What is love music? What is the notion of love within all of these forms of black music? Well, in many ways, they speak to a longer history of pain and caring and memory, right? So when you see a moment like this, it in many ways is like all of that coming together in a singular moment, right? So then how does that translate to painting? Well, maybe this is an idea of how this could translate to painting. So this is a portrait of Betsy Smith by my father. And I think what you can see is sort of like the complication of her face, right? Because I think that's another difficult thing to try to capture, are these like many expressions that exist in an image like this, right? This is many different things happening at once. So I think to create a realistic portrait, or what we might call mimesis, right? Or just a straight reflection of just the moment, right? Doesn't exactly capture that, because what she's doing here is she's going beyond that moment, right? She's going to like moments, plural, past, present, future, right? So in order to do that, you have to queer the image, you know? Or you have to, again, going back to Jaffa, what he might call like worrying the image. And that's also what's happening in the music as well. The music is like when she's singing a note, you know, it's not these like classical understandings of like, you know, traditional music. It goes beyond that, you know. And we'll get into that in a moment. But then also another person who's featured in They Have the Right to Sing the Blues is Sarah Vaughan, right? And I think in thinking about Sarah Vaughan, you have this incredible level of like intimacy in these moments, both like in a recording studio, in just her everyday life, to even the image that you select to sort of like capture what this album is doing, right? So if we look at Sarah Vaughan with Clifford Brown, you know, this album is doing many things, and I think one of those things that it does is it goes very deep into these sort of like somber moments that I think you can also see in an image like this in her like live performance as well. So then how does that even come, how do you then capture that in painting? Well, maybe here's a way that we could do that, right? Where ultimately it's not necessarily about the form that her face takes, right? But it's actually about the colors that inhabit that space and what those colors mean, right? And how they might be expressive of what the music is doing, right? So then to kind of think about like a brief sort of background on how my father even gets to this point of creating these portraits. So initially he was working in abstraction. If you go down there and to the right, you'll see a very large one, and that was kind of the main mode that he was working in, of these like kind of modes of like experimenting with staining, texture, things like that. That is sort of associated with like third wave abstract expressionism. From that, then he moves to figurative expressionism, and what we also call like neo-expressionism. I mean, probably one of the most well-known arbiters of that is like Jean-Michel Basquiat, right? So then the next kind of challenge that he gives for himself is, you know, how can I create portraits that are on the same level of somebody like Rembrandt, right? Well, I think one way that he was sort of trying to take all of these elements of like what he was doing before and trying to move it into like a new wave of portraiture is to combine the sort of emphasis on color and the ways that you can explore the field of color, right? And then bring that into portraiture. So in other words, like a skin tone doesn't necessarily have to be a brown or a tan or whatever you might think of as a normal skin tone, right? It can be made up of these many colors that have something to do with the mood that you're trying to create in the work. So this is called a blues man, right? So we can see the many blues that sort of inhabit the space, right? But we also see these like yellows as well. So there's something like maybe hope, there's something like maybe light that kind of sort of like eke through this sort of dark space. But in a lot of what he was trying to do with this like kind of new movement into portraiture is sort of create a combination of like, well, actually really to mainly like capture the spirit of these individuals whom he believed required a place within the realms of like our cultural history, at least in the American context, right? So I think a large part of that, right, is to understand the music is actually like a spiritual practice. So we see this image, this is West Montgomery, and this sort of like transcendent space that he comes into. So at this point, I kind of want to think about a definition of black performance that Fred Moten gives in his book In the Break, and I added a couple words in there. So anyway, so Moten writes, "Black performance has always been ongoing improvisation, a kind of lyricism of the surplus, pleasure, rupture, collision, augmentation, and transcendence." Right? So when we go back to an image like this, I think when we think about what is the goal with this type of portraiture, well, it is a sort of attempt at this surplus, right? It's an attempt at this like augmentation of the expression that is emanating out of this individual. It's a rupture of the normative ways in which we understand portraiture. And it's a collision of these colors in this space, right? That one might not think of normally as like, okay, these colors should occupy this space. Well, who's to say what should occupy where, right? And I think that's ultimately the intervention, right? But then going back to this notion of transcendence, again, it is also about, as I said before, capturing the spirit of these individuals. So when we see a portrait like this, you know, we see two sides of this individual. We see, you know, maybe what we might consider as like the everyday side, however you want to think of that, right? And then what happens within the performance, which is this moment of transcendence. And as I'll talk about a little bit earlier, we might even be able to think about it in the context of like a form of a transubstantiation, if you will. Yeah. And I love this quote by Fela. This is Fela Kuti. You know, the music is a spiritual thing. You don't play with it, right? So ultimately, you know, even though we talk about these images as a field of play, well, it's really not necessarily a field of play. It's a direct action towards getting at this spiritual thing, right? That also like one can't help but create. So what does it look like to be occupying this space of the spiritual thing, right? So the next couple images are what I sort of think of as entering this space, right? Or what I also want to call like the incantation. So the music sort of allows for the spirit to come into the space. And this is what we see happening here with Sam Rivers, with Elvin Jones, Little Richard. And I wanted to show this portrait as well of Coco Taylor, right? And I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but also this notion of the scream. And many scholars have sort of thought about this notion and thinking about Frederick Douglass's sort of recollection of his Aunt Esther's scream as she's being whipped, right? And that sort of pain, all that, because pain meaning many things, right? Moving through one's body over time, right? So it's a way of thinking of like, you know, this scream of Coco Taylor being no different from the scream of Aunt Esther, right? Or being the carrying of that memory, if you will. But as I said, it's also about entering a space, and ultimately, what does that space look like? So this is Jimi Hendrix, you know, and this is him in this space of the performance. And sometimes that can't be understood within a figurative realm. So then you get a work like this. So this is in Search of Jimmy's Space from 1971. So this is part of that earlier work that I was talking about before, where you know, notions of staining, texture are really, you know, are being foregrounded aesthetically. However, if we're thinking about what's the real project that's happening here, right? Well, it's an attempt to get to this space, this space, you know. And this is another rendition of that space, right? So this is James Brown during the moment of during a live performance of Please, Please, Please. And I'll mention this a little bit later, but this is also a moment where James Brown is also performing love as death, right? So it's searching to try to reach that space of the death, getting as close as one can to that space, right? And there being sort of like a euphoric pleasure within that space as well, and a necessity to occupy that space. And here we have Buddy Guy also occupying this space as well, as he's playing the guitar. And then again, how do you translate that into portraiture? Well, maybe here's a way in which we'd attempt to translate that, right? Where ultimately you're really on the borderline here between a figurative space and an abstract space. So then I think the next aspect of this notion of, you know, how does one create an active black performance, right, is this notion of searching. So what are these musicians also doing? They're searching for a trajectory, right? And I think one of the people who sort of tuned us into that is Ornette Coleman, who in his Collective Improvisations, and I have an image of Ornette somewhere, but, you know, he sort of opens the door to demonstrate that what this work, this music, or what also we can think of as, and Christina Sharp has talked about this a bit in her book, In the Wake, we can also think about this as wake work as well. So you're working through this memory, this memory, and I want to say this all thatness of a black experience. Right? So we're searching for this trajectory. So that is part of what is happening in some of these images. Here we see Ed Blackwell. Here we see John Coltrane, right? Who in one of his earliest attempts to sort of break free from the structure and at that time maybe strictures of bebop in this album Ascendance, right? He is searching for a space, and as we can kind of see John Coltrane sort of looking up, and also his horn or saxophone sort of making the same sort of gesture upward in this act of searching. So again, how do we try to find that space in a visual art? Well, maybe here's an answer to that, right? Where we can kind of see John Coltrane looking out into we don't know where, right? And I think that's a really important aspect of this work, in that, you know, the background is abstracted, right? So we see that we are in this sort of like timeless space. So that's how we can understand that we are in this like other space searching for, again, we don't know exactly what, but it's a trajectory, right? And here's Ornette Coleman And here is my father's portrait of Ornette, where again, he's searching, right? He's searching for a new language, right? And ultimately that comes with the collective improvisation. And here is Anthony Braxton, another avant-garde sort of jazz musician. And I think this portrait of him is very interesting because, you know, the space that he's sort of occupying is, again, is abstracted in this way. So that maybe this trajectory that he's looking towards is an abstract space. It doesn't actually exist within this realm. Or another way to think about it is this individual sort of transforms into this sort of abstract expression, right? In what he is trying to do in the space that he's trying to occupy. Okay. Another thing I wanted to think about is what I want to call the Moan, right? So here we have Dizzy Gillespie in his sort of like infamous way that he could like kind of like just pack air into his cheeks and then blast it out of the horn, right? And that's what I want to think of as the moan, right? So it exists not just as we think of moans maybe in like blues music, right? But it also exists in the way in which the horn occupies a space that is directly sort of direct, like, which essentially is the human voice, right? Like the horn and the human voice are one and the same. And so when we're seeing these screeches, I kind of want to think of them as moans. So then how do we sort of see that within a portraiture, right? When you can't really, it's a visual form that doesn't necessarily have a, audio component to it, right? Well, I think it has a lot to do with the way in which the face and the eyes are sort of drawn, right? In that we see that as these individuals are closing their eyes, they're going somewhere else. So in other words, the moan, going back to this idea of incantation, is sort of that note that we hit to go somewhere else, right? And we can see sort of as this kind of moan is happening in this image here, we can see how this like spirit is also coming out of this individual as well. And that's kind of what we see on the side there. And one individual who I think really sort of expresses this idea of the moan, but this time instead of a horn, it's the drums, right? Is Art Blakey, who's sort of known for this like very hard-hitting percussion that is central to this idea of like hard bop, right? So maybe we can think of the moan as also a mode of percussion, right? Which Blakey is somebody who had studied in depth sort of West African drumming techniques, is calling back to this idea of the call drum, right? Which is a drum that is sort of meant to make the space prepared for like this like spiritual entrance, right? So the moan can also do that as well. And I just wanted to kind of show, a lot of these are actually screenshots that I took from performances, but I wanted to show the way in which this like montage is a really interesting way that this kind of idea of like the player and the spirit being two things that exist in the same space at the same time are sort of, or can be like captured on film maybe. And then this is just, again, well, this is Miles Davis, and I think he's also somebody who also expresses this idea of the moan, but in a very different way that's kind of more somber, more cool, but it's like still the same kind of work that somebody like maybe Dizzy Gillespie is doing with this more like high pitch, right? It's the same type of work. It's the same type of opening for spiritual entrance, right? So the next thing I wanted to think about in terms of acts of black performance is this notion of like swagger and cool, right? So here we have a screenshot from Mary J. Blige, I'm Going Down, right? Which is a great music video if anybody hasn't seen it. Okay. But I think somebody who articulates the notion that coolness exists beyond just like this like idea of hip, beyond like an aesthetic. It is actually something that is a very spiritual practice, and somebody who articulates this very well is Robert Ferris Thomas. And I'm just going to read a quote from him where he's sort of linking this notion of cool to West African practices. In other words, this idea of being cool, right, especially when we think about black performance, is something that is linked to a past, right? It is not something that just exists merely for whatever, right? It is something that is actually very purposeful in the way that it's employed. So Thomas writes, "The telling point is that the mask of coolness is worn not only in times of stress, but also in times of pleasure, in fields of expressive performance and the dance. Control, stability, composure, under the African rubric of the cool, seem to constitute elements of all-embracing aesthetic attitude. Struck by the reoccurrence of this vital notion elsewhere in tropical Africa and the Black Americas, I've come to the term of the attitude of an aesthetic of cool in the sense of a deeply and completely motivated, consciously artistic interweaving of elements, serious and pleasurable, of responsibility and of play. Manifest within this philosophy of the cool is the belief that the purer, the cooler a person becomes, the more ancestral he becomes. In other words, the mastery of self enables a person to transcend time and elude preoccupation. He can concentrate, or she can concentrate, upon truly important matters of social balance and aesthetic substance, creative matters of full motion and brilliance." So it's a mastery of self, right? Is the other kind, is really what I'm trying to get at here in this notion of why cool is important when we look at these individuals. I mean, when you look at a lot of these portraits, you're like, man, like that person looks really cool. Like, you know, what does that mean? Well, it's really an art form, right? And it's an art form that has purpose. And it's an art form that is equally as important as the music, right? So when we look at, you know, in other words, like the swagger of somebody like Mary J. Blige, right, as she's moving down these like staircases in this, it's like, well, it's multiple, but, you know, there's a cool element to that that augments what's happening in the music, right? So if we look at this image of Thelonious Monk, somebody who we can think of as a real champion of cool, right? You know, I think an important aspect of like, you know, reflecting that, whether it be portraiture, photography, or whatever, you know, how do you reflect cool? Well, maybe this is an answer. Like, you know, like this is just an incredible photograph. That like, that's really all I have to say about it. It's really an incredible photograph that what it's doing is it's reflecting, and whether this is, you know, and of course this is partially the photographer's intention, but it's also Thelonious Monk's awareness of self, right? Why wear those glasses? You know what I mean? You know that those are reflecting the keys like that, right? It's an active stance of I'm being cool because it's augmenting what I'm doing on the stage in the music, right? And I also think that it's important to think about how the music and this notion of, and everything that we sort of talked about is also a part of this notion of dreaming as well, which is a part of what this transcendence is. It's to dream oneself beyond the circumstances that they exist in at this moment in time. That's what the music does, you know. So in looking at these kind of three photographs of Thelonious Monk, you know, I was really thinking about this portrait here by my father, which is actually this is actually my favorite portrait of his. But, you know, I was kind of looking through photos, and there is the Thelonious Monk cover that is this, right? But another kind of one of the points that I want to make as I'm kind of talking through all of these portraits is that it is all this that makes up this portrait. You are bringing together all of these moments to create this portrait, because you have to include the space that that individual is going to or in. You have to include the swagger. You have to include the power of the music. And that also has to do with also the scale of some of these images too. Like, I mean, I don't have an exact dimension on there, but I mean, this image is like that wall, right? And you've seen in the other room too, the size of these portraits. Well, that's because that's the power of the music, you know. Somebody like Jackson Pollock and also Mark Rothko talk about, you know, the notion of size within this idea of the sublime, right? Well, that has to do with the music as well. And I guess while I'm on the notion of Mark Rothko and Jackson Pollock, it's like, you know, I think there's a way in which we think of these ideas as coming out of nowhere. Like, you know, abstract expressionism comes out of nowhere, right? I mean, there's some steps to it, but it seems as though it is reacting to what came right before it. Well, going back to Arthur Jaffe again, and he has this wonderful essay called My Black Death, and he's not the only one who's thought about this, others have as well. But I think that it's important to think about how maybe these artists were also reacting to black aesthetics, and black aesthetics being sort of the starting point for thinking about how to move to the next thing. So, I mean, just a quick example before I go on, but like you look at somebody like Jackson Pollock, you know, he was dancing around the canvas. That's how he got the paint on the canvas, right? And what was he dancing to? Well, he was dancing to Count Basie, right? So, you know, when you look at at it like that, right, to understand that the music is the thing that's driving the hand, right? That's driving the coolness of the thing, right? That's driving the space that this artist is trying to occupy, right, or react to. Then that's a whole other understanding of art history, I think. But I wanted to include these images again because to really demonstrate that coolness is a space, right? And Miles Davis being one of the main cool cats, you know. So, but yeah, coolness is a space. It is an intentional space that individuals occupy. So, and maybe this is a way that we can reflect that in a portrait, right? So another thing to think about as we're looking through the idea of how we create an action of black performance, right, is one's intimacy to the instrument, right? So these are a couple stills from Alice Coltrane performing with Pharoah Sanders. But I think it's incredible to see the intimacy with which she strokes the harp, right? The way that she's looking not only at the harp, but beyond the harp as well, to move the harp beyond what it can normally do. And that's how you worry the note, right? That's how you move beyond these normal notes, as you look beyond them, right? And we see how much, like, the hand is such an important aspect. I mean, that's obvious, right? But, like, it's the tactility of it is also a spiritual act, right? We go back to Elvin Jones, too, to understand that this intimacy is work, right? Man, he's sweating, you know? Like, that's work. He's working that instrument. And that's a part of, you know, this idea of moving beyond oneself, is because it's an action in this wake work. It's an action in connecting to something beyond yourself, you know? Then that brings me to the ensemble, right, which is another important aspect of how we capture black performance, or ultimately what black aesthetics is. It's this stitching together of these multiple elements, right, whether it be sound, whether it be visual, whether it be what have you, right? This notion of the collective is very important, and we go back to Ornette Coleman's Collective Improvisation, right, where what he ultimately did was allowed all the instruments to sort of improvise collectively, so each person could improvise on their own register, right? But they're all working together towards a trajectory, right? So any one instrument can't do it on their own, right? It's all of these instruments together that create, you know, the entrance of a spiritual space, or create the spiritual space. And we see how both of these individuals are in sync with where they're going, you know, and you can kind of tell, you know, I mean, it's a simple thing, but their eyes are closed, but, you know, they're both moving to this space that exists beyond what we're seeing in the image. So the next thing I want to talk about is what I call shifts, right? So in each moment you shift from one tone to the next. I mean, that's obvious. That's how the song moves along, right? but there's also a shift in the emotions that exist within a song, right? And that's a way that we, in many ways, like carry memory, because memory is complicated, right? So when you look at somebody like Lee Morgan, which, by the way, there's a great documentary on Lee Morgan They Called Him Morgan. It's fantastic. But when you look at somebody like Lee Morgan going from this emotion to this emotion, right? These are two very different registers, but they exist towards the same trajectory, right? Or, because these are two different moments, obviously. Or if we look at like one moment, right, where it's shifting from one emotion to the next. We can look at somebody like Billie Holiday, right, where as she's singing I Loves You Porgy, right, which is a complicated song, right, and it's talking about love and loss and all these things, right? You're shifting from this emotion, right, to this emotion, which are ultimately on the same register, but they're doing two different things, but they work together to create one single sort of like understanding of that moment, right? Or attempt to, right? So maybe how do you capture that in something like, you know, one of my father's portraits? Well, maybe here's a way that we can do that, right? So this is called Billy's Blues. This is one of his earlier portraits. And we see the complexity of like, the fact that, you know, when we're talking about a song like I Loves You Porgy, right? Obviously, it's not necessarily a song about Billie Holiday, right? But she ultimately makes it about her own narrative, right? So that's one thing that's kind of intrinsic to all of this music, is that one is embodying it both from a personal and collective history, right? So, the next thing I want to talk about is, and I guess it's on that note, is love as death, right? So here's a series of photographs, and this is, that's Lightning Hopkins in the back, and a lesser-known blues musician, but a friend of his. Both musicians from sort of near Houston, Texas. But I think maybe closer to Galveston. But anyway, so I wanted to show these series of stills, right, where this individual is talking about losing his love, right? Where you go from here to here to here to here. And he's like, really, it's a performance, right? It's really a performance to here. So all of this kind of demonstrates that this maybe could be like, you know, we think of love as one thing, right? But the way then it filters through the music, it's also thinking about one's sort of experience in not only just love, but also their experience as a black person existing in this space, right? All of that comes together in this music, right? So then maybe when we see that, we see something like the spirit of Walter Lee, or this image here, right? Where it's like complicated. It's like it's not only pain, but it's pleasure, and it's memory, and it's where do I go from here, and it's all these things together, right? So the next topic or theme within this notion of capturing or acting upon black performance is transcendence, right? Which is actually something that's connected to what I want to think about as gospel, right? It is, you know, in many ways it's been, I mean, in many ways I think when we think about transcendence, we articulate it within like a sort of religious experience, kind of. And many times in black performance, it is existing in these like religious spaces of like the church house and things like that. And when you listen to like many songs, you know, you talk about things like crossing the River Jordan, things like that. And it's an attempt to move beyond one space that they're in right now. And it's a form that one has to take in order to have the music register in the proper way, right? So when we look at somebody like Sister Rosetta Thorpe, right? As she's singing about this train, right? This train that is taking us to this next place, right? We see all of, you know, this kind of like looking towards something else, and the work that that takes, and the like it's not only like power and force, but it's fear, and it's hope and searching, and it's like also intention too. It's a space in which many these individuals, and especially I think in a position of like black women as well, where you can be intentional, right, and occupy that space, you know. And so this is actually an image of Jimmy Rushing. But that being said, I think that it's really interesting how, you know, and I guess part of why I wanted to show this image is because when we think about a lot of these narratives of black music, often what's foregrounded is this notion of like masculinity, and maybe that this woman might have a masculinity to whatever, right? But really I want to think about it's actually the counter to that is existing within these images here. It's actually a particular mode of like, not necessarily, maybe like a mode of like a power of black femininity that exists not just like in somebody like Sister Rosetta Tharpe, but also in somebody like Jimmy Rushing, as he's kind of singing in this like somber moment where it's somewhere between like a moan and a scream, right? And that brings me actually to the next topic, which is the scream, right? Which, as we talked about a little bit before, kind of can be linked to these moments of black pain, right? But also it's about getting the spirit. It's about another kind of mode of transcendence, which is not just within the music, right? But it's also in this act of preaching. So here we see Desmond Tutu. And this is the same action, right? I guess it's part of what I'm trying to say. Okay. So to kind of move beyond music as we move towards the latter end of this discussion, I wanted to think about also how, you know, the reason why this music is so important is because it permeates through all different types of modes of black performance, whether it be acting, right? So this is, oh my God, why am I blanking? This is Denzel Washington in the most recent Macbeth, where we have this moment of searching, of longing, of fear, all of this captured in the same kind of register as the music that we've been seeing up until this point, right? Or we see somebody like Sidney Poitier with this like moment of the scream, right? Of a freeing of oneself, or an attempt to, right? We see this in dance as well, where as we've kind of seen throughout, and I should have put the image, but it's fine. As we saw in the image of James Brown, right? It was not just about what he was saying, but it was also about what his body was doing to emphasize that as well, right? So it's a notion that black performance, and I mean this is obvious, but just to sort of like reiterate, it's not just about, you know, what is being vocalized or what is being heard, right, or all these things, but it's also about how the body is also moving within this space in what Danielle Goldman has called like the practice of freedom, right? That's a physical act as well. And I think we see it in this incredible still of Zendaya from Malcolm and Marie, right? Where you have this incredible moment of like she's occupying this space in such a powerful way that is, to me, in the same kind of register as somebody like the image, or as like the images of Sarah Vaughan that we saw earlier, right? It's this somber power that she's using at this moment to kind of create space for herself, right? The next thing I want to talk about is the stage, right? Which is what I think is ultimately the platform for this transubstantiation. What I mean by that is that transformation from the individual to the spirit of the performance, which is connected to a collective history and a personal history. It's that action of the transformation, right? So here we see Nina Simone, where and it's an incredible still too, because it's also like the background is sort of like abstracted in all the space. We don't know like necessarily where she is, but she's on this stage and she is becoming Nina Simone, right? I think that's actually the title of the documentary. But I think it is. But anyway, so she's becoming this person, right? That is not just her, but it's this collective history that she's trying to evoke, right? We also see it in these like very simple moments of like preparation as well, right? Where it's like there's a preparation to creating the stage, right? And I think what's so incredible about the stage is this dichotomy between, well, this dichotomy and the lack thereof between the audience and the performer. In this incredible, I think, photograph, we see that Monk is like in his own space, right? That does all the things that we had talked about earlier, of like coolness, of like transformation, all that, right, is happening in this moment, and it's happening within his dream, right? And people are sort of like witnessing this dream. So I think it's an interesting question of like, you know, what does the stage do, and how does it interact with like an audience, right? Do you need the audience for this like stage of performance? Or is the music ultimately doing that action of activating the space? And I would argue that that music is actually doing the work of activating the space. And it's really interesting, especially when you look at the audience, and it's a mostly white audience as well, that's sort of like witnessing this, and sort of, and I mean, that's a much longer discussion about like, what is it, you know, what does it mean to have these white audiences witness these black performers in sort of like a need to see this sort of expression, right? And especially when you think about American music and American culture being so based off of black performance, right? Okay. And I think it goes for like these immense public spaces, and you have this incredible photograph of Billie Holiday performing with Count Basie, actually. It works for public spaces, it also works for private spaces. And this is kind of a lot of the work that I do now, but it's like, you know, there's something about, like in the 1970s in New York, you had the appearance of these loft spaces in which musicians were taking over these spaces in order to sort of have a space to rehearse, right? Then soon artists followed and what have you. But there's a level in which this registers on the same level as this, right? This massive space is registering on the same level of performance as this intimate space, right? And I think what was very important about these loft spaces is it gives us an understanding of black performance as multi, right? So this is a still from one of my father's pieces, Stolen Moments, right? Where you see dance, you see the painting, you see the music, you also see film, right? So black performance is innately multi in the way in which it's working. And we've kind of talked about that in the ways in which like it's the music, it's the body, it's the environment, it's all these things together, right? And so kind of the last thing that I want to talk about in terms of the music sort of has to do with what's called the woodshed, right? Which is the space behind the stage, right? So what does it mean to prepare for this moment of transubstantiation, right? And in some of these photographs, we see some of the most intimate moments of these individuals. So how do you then reflect that in painting? And maybe here's a way in which we can see that, right? Where it's like we see the other space that Louis Armstrong is about to enter, right? We see him young, we see him older, right? And then I also want to think about, again, sort of these alternative histories. So we have this incredible photograph of James Brown done by Diane Arbus, who was very well known for photographing individuals on the fringes of society. That was really her primary body of photography. So we see this like really unique photograph of James Brown, in which, you know, for the most part, when we see images of James Brown, what's really foregrounded is his masculinity. And what's incredible about this photograph is we see this like immense, like this femininity come out as well that was so central to his performance, right? So then when we see, I think, my father's interpretation, I think it also sort of lends itself to that, where oftentimes we see James Brown like up and out, but in this moment he's very somber, right? And there's a level to like, which like, it's sort of pushing back against this like ultra masculine sort of like imagery. And the last one I wanted to end with is, again, sort of bringing this all together, that, you know, ultimately the objective is to give reverence to, and maybe for a moment occupy the spiritual space that these individuals occupy in these moments. So here we see B.B. King in his performance. And ultimately, I think in many ways, the goal is to free oneself, right, from what is appropriate to show, right? What is appropriate to paint? Who, like, and if we look at this last image, like how one goes about a portrait, right? All these things are things to combat, right? And also, I mean, first and foremost, and the main thing being like, who's allowed to occupy these portraits? So oftentimes when we think about what portraiture does, it's to give space to important people, right? So the primary goal of this project for my father, for the most part, was really to give these individuals the reverence they deserve as Black performers and as individuals who are central to not only the cultural narrative of like the United States, but also globally. I mean, Black music is the arguably most influential music across the world, right? And there's no coincidence to that, right? There's a reason for that. And I think that what my father is trying to do here is give space to these individuals. So I think the last thing I'll show is just like my most recent work as an artist has sort of been trying to bring together this notion of how Black performance and aesthetics reaches across all different disciplines and ways in which we see the world. So what I've been doing is sort of creating these collages that bring together images of Black performers, as well as models, as well as spaces, and sort of saying that all of these are kind of reflecting one another in sort of trying to register on the same level of the avant-garde. And ultimately, what I'm trying to say, and what my father was also trying to say, is that these performers are the avant-garde. So, I'll just show a couple more images of some of this work. Okay. Thank you. We actually got through all the images. Amazing. Does... Mm-hmm. Or comments or concerns? Mm-hmm. Uh-huh. Yep.
It's so nice to see that because everything that you were talking about feels very connected.
Yeah. Yeah, if I can just go to, this collage. I mean, I really wanted to demonstrate also, and I think, kind of echoing what my father was trying to achieve as well, is like, there's also a way in which a lot of this work is aesthetic, right? It's aesthetic for aesthetic's sake, right? And it can be spiritual too, right? In other words, I think one thing that we are both adamantly against is a reduction of like Black expression to political expression, right? There's a way in which the Black body and the expressions that emanate from these bodies are always seen as like political. And so what I wanted to do, and especially like in sort of like reflecting different movements within the body and then in like other images, is trying to demonstrate like there is a way in which this is just aesthetic, and that's a part of the power of it. I mean, and that is intrinsically also tied to like how incredibly like spiritual this work is, So thank you, I appreciate that. Yeah.
I love the way that you talk about your father's work with providing a rupture and a
Mm-hmm.
collision of color.
Mm-hmm.
That was sort of a reverent entry point
Mm-hmm.
to this collective Moan.
Mm-hmm.
And I like the way that of his work a lot
Mhm.
more to me about it's the work that is the opening.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so it's those reverent characters that
Yeah.
give us that opening and that understanding.
Yeah.
And then that freedom of movement that comes
Right.
after that. And when
Right.
the way that you explained that really did give me new insight into kind of his methodology,
Mhm.
reasoning for painting who he
Right.
painted and choosing
Right.
expressions that he did,
Right.
merging abstract expressionism with the figurative,
Right.
abstract with the figurative.
Right.
He really broke that down
Mhm.
for us. And this is a personal question, but knowing I knew your father so well, I've known you so well for so long.
Mhm.
But I wonder, we lost your father way too soon.
Mhm.
I wonder if you have, getting a space from his
Mhm.
passing,
Mhm.
what you feel in what he gave you as in your youth,
Mhm.
your understanding of jazz, black
Mhm.
culture,
Mhm.
spirituality,
Mhm.
and getting some space from it
Mhm.
now in what you've grown in your understanding
Yeah.
by not having him here to elaborate it
Yeah.
verbally with you.
Yeah.
Like, what is that new understanding you have
Mhm.
through his work, but not being able to have that call and response with him
Yeah.
physically anymore?
Right.
What if you can shed some light on kind of your relationship with him now through his
Yeah.
work after his passing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a large part of that is like what I'm seeing now is like his what he was trying to connect, right? He was trying to connect all these different things. And the main thing that he gave me was understanding of myself and an empowerment of myself, that I can be a black person in this world and be empowered, right? But I think now I'm kind of getting an understanding as well as like how he was really linking this work to like many different aspects of black aesthetics that reach beyond just like what he was trying to do, but also reach to things like, for example, like the, like maybe like the conceptual work of David Hammond's. Like all these things kind of like come together to create different perspectives on kind of a similar understanding to who we are as black people, Yeah, and I think it was really interesting what you were saying earlier also about like this notion of the rupture, right? And I think that that's another thing I've kind of come to understand now is like I didn't necessarily understand the work as so much of a rupture until now, but I understand that also the need for the rupture is to break one out of the normative space that we exist in. You cannot enter that spiritual space without breaking out of the space that you exist in right now. So, and I kind of took it as, I think when I was young, is just like that's just how it is. But now I understand like the serious need for that you have to rupture in order to move to that next space. So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I just so appreciate I could look at one of his pieces and appreciate the meaning, but to know what he was trying to capture
Mm-hmm.
by all those moments.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, it just makes it so much more meaningful.
Well, thank you.
Beautiful.
Yeah, especially when you understand that like these are people's lives, like that's really the thing. We see the portraits and it's just like, okay, whatever, moving on. But like when you see the depth of like not only the work but where the inspiration comes from, right? Then that's like a whole nother thing,
You changed my experience.
Oh, thank you. I don't know.
Like the spiritual
Mhm.
connection, because
Mhm.
I think life is spiritual.
Yeah.
And for us to be connected,
Mhm.
we have to
Yeah.
recognize
Mhm.
that as we're talking about the rupture,
Yeah.
we've got to open ourselves
Yeah.
up to the spirit.
Yeah.
And I'm not just talking about a religious
Right.
experience. I'm talking about the spirit that connects
Yeah.
everyone and
Yeah.
everything.
Yeah.
And I pictures and thinking about the background of these people and how it's expressed in their art, in
Yeah.
their music, in their dance,
Yeah.
their portrayals on stage, you know.
Yeah.
That is, I just had never looked at it that way before. So you've opened my eyes.
Oh, thank.
I feel ruptured.
Yeah. No, that's good. You know, we're all trying to feel right. But like, yeah, you know, it's because, you know, like, Black aesthetics is innately like spiritual because like art is light. Like from like what has carried across time, across the, because enslavement is a rupture, right? A violent rupture. Right, but what is carried through that, what is carried through, again, what I've called as the wake, right, is this understanding that art is life. Like there is no distinction between the two. You know, our world's aesthetic, and that what runs through that is like a spiritual component to everything that we do, that's especially enacted within like this music, and then within also visual components to it, performance, what have you. Like all that is then activated on another register, you know. But that is always there throughout all kind of different aspects of life. Yeah, and I think that's also one of the things I try to express in these works is that you know, how like what I like to think of as the aestheticness of life is constant, you know. So yeah.
There's this SpongeBob SquarePants quote from David Bowie.
Mm-hmm.
It says something like, art happens when you allow yourself to dream.
Mm-hmm.
And your father, like, not only the rupture of pain, but also just, he required people to dream. He provided the runway for dreaming
Absolutely.
as a necessity, as a must. It
Mm-hmm.
wasn't a hope. It was like he
Yeah.
willed dreaming, and he said
Yeah,
that
yeah.
was the way that life ultimately needed to
Right.
be.
Right.
And so he was tempting to get buckled down by
Yeah.
not doing the work so
Right,
that
right.
you could dream.
Right,
and
right.
he was always dreaming.
Yeah.
And I think by you, you know, you're continuing that trajectory in a very different and new, nuanced way that is building more on that legacy. So, you know, we're lucky for that.
Oh, and you know, I think what you said is what I really love about what you said is that, like, yes, absolutely. Like, growing up in that household, it was like dreaming was the innate thing. Like, there was no question that the dreaming existed, right? I think that to answer your earlier question, what I found out as I moved along throughout my life is what a world looks like when you don't dream, you know? So it's a necessity to dream, you know, the dreaming is a necessity, you know? So, yeah, I mean, that's the number one thing I think I learned from my dad is like, you must, like, there's nothing without the dreaming, you know? And I think that goes for all of these musicians who we've seen today is like, they were all dreaming, you know? And then also, I mean, took on various aspects of that, right? Whether it be the reality, whether it be going to, you know, what have you. But like, what makes the work so powerful is the dreaming. Like that's the rupture, is like seeing something outside of our reality. It's like like you see those dreams and you're like, whoa, you know what I mean? I didn't know, like, and that's why it's such a transcendent space, is because it moves you beyond. Like you can't help but go into the dream. You know, that's the power of the thing, I think. Yeah.